Hey everybody, it's Mike. It's Monday, December 13th. Yes, it's the 13th of 2021. And I finally had the opportunity to watch episode 3 of Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary. And so I'm going to share my insights. Also, as a reminder, all I'm doing is sharing my observations and opinions. If what I present resonates, that's great. If not, that's okay too. There is no sense in anybody watching my content and getting upset because I'm not saying what you want me to say or what you want to hear about the Beatles. This is not what my channel is all about. Okay, so I just want to say that before we get started. Also, please watch the presentation before commenting. It's very easy to tell when somebody leaves a comment and they haven't watched the video. And when I pick up on that, what happens is your comment gets deleted. Because I have a rule of thumb. If you don't have time, I don't have time. Okay, so just keep that in mind as well. Also, a couple of my British listeners said, Mike, Twickenham is Twickenham. We don't pronounce the H, so I'm sorry about that. Going forward, I will use the British pronunciation. In my previous video on episode 2, I had mentioned that I didn't think that Billy had any baffling on his microphone when he was on the rooftop, and I was incorrect. When I watched the rooftop in episode 3 of Peter's documentary, we could see that Billy does have baffling. And the reason why it was difficult to tell from the stills, which were at a distance, is because it's a different color. The baffling on the other mics was black, so it looked like that he didn't have any baffling on his microphone, but like I said, he did, so I stand corrected. Also, in my previous video on episode 2, based upon discussions that I had with a friend of mine who is a professional sound engineer, I talked about slicing single bars from various takes into a final version, and I said it was like cutting and pasting. This is referred to as comping or composite editing, and I will leave a link down below in the description box if you want to learn more about how that process works. Last but not least, before I get into episode 3, I did not examine the documentary for AI, CGI, or deep fake. I'm not an expert in these areas, so I will leave that to those people who have skills to identify that type of technology in film. That being said, in all likelihood, at the very least, Peter was using artificial intelligence in order to restore and enhance the footage. Okay? All right, so with that, let me move to slide number 3. So we start episode 3 on January 26th, and we get a snippet of the song Let It Be, and we also have Billy instructing Ringo on how he wants the drums played on Let It Be. And the expression on Ringo's face is priceless. He's annoyed, and I know what he's thinking. Back off, Boogaloo. And then we move to January 27th, and here we have them running through old cover songs again. This is something that we see over and over again, from episode 1 right through episode 3. But on the 27th, it's a bit problematic because at the time they're scheduled to do the rooftop performance on the 29th. It later got rescheduled to the 30th because of weather conditions that were forecasted for the 29th, so they moved it out a day. But on the 27th, they still have January 29th scheduled in for the rooftop. And so why they are not focused on original songs that they would play on the rooftop, I don't know. It's really an enigma. And again, like I said, this is something that we see them do throughout the Get Back sessions in Peter's film. And then George comes in with Old Brown Shoe and says that he wrote it the previous evening. It's the same backstory we got with I Me Mine. So as a reminder, in episode 1, George tells the others that he has a stack of songs that he wrote coming into the Get Back sessions For example, songs like Isn't It a Pity? But now he's writing material in the evening after spending all day in the studio. So the backstory here with I Me Mine and Old Brown Shoe appears very contrived. It came across to me like it's completely scripted. And then we had that scene that Paul Jansen and I called out when we did our show together, where Billy's playing George's Telecaster upside down without swapping the string positions. But as you watch the scene, Billy is not strumming or playing chords. He's playing single note riffs. And so him playing the guitar this way is very possible. And then there's another moment where the audio appears dubbed in, and we see this a number of times throughout the documentary, which, by the way, its total runtime is just under 8 hours. And in all fairness, at the beginning of each episode, Peter has a disclaimer which states that where they only had audio, they tried to match up some video or visual to bring the experience together. Okay, but that being said, there are a number of moments where the audio is dubbed in. All right, so let's move to slide number 4. Now, I call this scene vindication of what Mike observed in the studio. So, George Martin comes into where they're playing. He steps out of the control room, and he's on them about all the instruments coming through the PA and tells them the sound is mucked up. So I'm thinking, these guys have been in the studio before. With all of their recording experience, how did that room get set up the way it did? And it's not just the Beatles I put on a hook for this, but what about Glyn Johns and even to a certain degree, George Martin? Because from what I was able to tell, that room where the mics were positioned, the PA and all that, that was like that since day one when they walked into Apple on January 22nd. Then George Martin tells John to turn down his bass, and Lennon responds, he cannot tell if he's in tune or not. And then George Martin says the PA keeps howling, and this is because the microphones are all in different directions. And then we hear Billy say, if only we could hear what each other is playing. Now, my observation at this point is this issue is being addressed on January 27th, yet the setup, best I can tell, has been the same since the Beatles stepped into Apple on January 22nd. So it's being addressed 5 days after they started recording. So again, what's running through my mind is, how are they getting quality recordings? So this whole moment was very surreal because I was pointing this out very early on. And I had no idea that this dialogue was in episode 3. So when George Martin stepped out of the control room to talk to them about the setup, I thought to myself, well, okay, so maybe I'm not crazy. And if we go back to the quote from John Lennon in an interview he did with Rolling Stone titled Lennon Remembers, and I covered this in my episode 2 analysis, John was defending Phil Spector's work on the Let It Be album. And to revisit the quote, John says, Spector, was given the shittiest load of badly recorded shit with a lousy feeling toward it ever. And he made something out of it. He did a great job. And the question I asked back in my episode 2 review is, how did Phil Spector clean up the, quote, shittiest load of badly recorded shit? It's still an enigma to me, folks. Let's go to slide number 5. Okay, so then we see Alan Parsons, and he's the tape operator. And of course, Alan Parsons later formed the Alan Parsons Project. And then we get snippets of Get Back being played. And the film tells us that the January 27th take of Get Back ended up on the Let It Be album. And as I mentioned in my episode 2 review, this date syncs up with Wikipedia. The Beatles' Bible, if I read it correctly, said the final take was on January 30th, which would have been the Rooftop. But Peter's film is in sync with the Wikipedia dates. I also noted that the playback scenes sound much better than what we are hearing in the studio. So as an example, when they're playing in the studio and then we have this cut to them in the control room and we hear the playback, what's coming through the playback speakers, or allegedly coming through the playback speakers, sounds a lot better than what we were hearing when they were playing the song in the studio. So I had to ask myself the question, was the audio in the playback scenes in the control room, were they dubbed in? Just a thought. Another observation I made as I was making my way through episode 1 through 3 is George's guitar playing is hot and cold. Sometimes he appears to be playing very well, and other times not so well. Again, just something I observed. Then Billy tells the others there are still a lot of songs they haven't rehearsed, and of course at this point it's late in the game. It's January 27th and Billy is stating the obvious. And then we have this very interesting moment in the film. So they're breaking for the day and they're leaving the control room and George Martin says, "William." And Billy turns around and then George Martin and Billy have a quick exchange. So it wasn't Billy Preston, because they weren't calling Billy Preston William at any time during the documentary. And the fact that George Martin says William and Billy turns around says that he was talking to Billy. This is very reminiscent of the scene in Billy's film going back to the 1980s, Give My Regards to Broad Street, where he walks into the control room and George Martin is there and is a sound engineer, and George Martin introduces Billy to the sound engineer as William. So those two scenes are very, very similar. Okay, so let's move to slide number 6. All right, so now it's January 28th, and the Rooftop, as I mentioned, was originally scheduled for January 29th, but it was moved to January 30th because of weather conditions. John mentions, let's pick up and do songs in pieces. So he's trying to get something together, to pull a set together for the Rooftop. Then we have a quick snippet of George introducing the song Something, a very early version of it. And then John Lennon starts to talk about how much he likes Alan Klein. And then we get another snippet of Old Brown Shoe. And then we hear Don't Let Me Down. And again, it sounds like the album version was dubbed in. And then we get John playing the riff to I Want You, She's So Heavy. And there's more wine drinking and smoking. And this is something that takes place throughout the sessions as depicted by Peter's documentary, Get Back. Now to the right, I'm going to read 2 quotes from the 1971 interview that John did with Rolling Stone magazine, titled Lennon Remembers. And it's another example of the historical narrative, which is documented, where we get an understanding that John did not want to do these sessions. He was not into it. And when we lay it up against what Peter is presenting in his documentary, because now that I've watched the entire Get Back film, the impression I got, and I'll cover this later, Peter is, in my mind, definitely trying to put a happy face on a not so very happy time along the Beatle timeline, which was the Let It Be period. So let me read what John said in Rolling Stone back in 1971. And again, this is only 2 years after the Get Back sessions. John said the conditions under which the Beatles created Let It Be were similar to the conditions under which they made Magical Mystery Tour. And so John says, quote, in a nutshell, Paul wanted to make It Was Time for another Beatle movie or something, and Paul wanted us to go on the road or do something. As usual, George and I were going, oh, We don't want to do it. Fuck, and all that. Paul set it up, and there was all this discussion about where to go and all that. I would just tag along, and I had Yoko by then. I didn't even give a shit about anything. I was stoned all the time too, on H, etc. And I just didn't give a shit. And nobody did, you know. So there's John telling us where his head was at, going into the sessions and also during the sessions. He didn't give a shit. And he also mentions, of course, that he was high and he was doing heroin. And I had mentioned that I didn't see a heroin addict through episodes 1, 2, or 3, but if John says he was stoned, then he was stoned. Okay, so let's move to slide number 7. And so they're in the studio, and John announces to the others that Alan Klein is upstairs for a meeting, and Billy makes a face. Because Billy was not a big fan of Alan Klein, and those of us who know Beatle history, he was looking to have his father-in-law, Lee Eastman, run the operations and not Alan Klein. So that's the reason why Billy made that face. And then there's this conversation and chatter, and we hear Glenn Johns say, Alan Klein is a very strange man, but clever. And then Michael Lindsay Hogg asks, how many numbers will they have for the rooftop? And John says 5 to 6. And this is another moment where John's voice sounds dubbed in. And Michael Lindsay Hogg tells the band they will use 9 cameras, so there's the number 9, plus a, quote, hidden camera in the reception area. Billy tells the others they need to expand beyond albums, and they, meaning the band, have no aim. And what he's saying is they need to expand their horizons beyond coming in, recording, doing an album, and then going home. And it's another situation where we have dialogue where Billy is trying to offer up direction, meaning a future, and there is no real response from the others in the band. And then John says they're not ready to do 14 songs, and I'm thinking, no kidding. It's January 28th. And then George asks how many songs are, quote, good enough, and John says none. And Michael Lindsay Hogg tells them they have lots of good stuff on film, but no story. And then George says he doesn't really want to perform on the roof, but he will if he has to. And Ringo says he wants to do it. And it was another part of the film where we see George being the one that is logically thinking through things. And I'm sure what he was thinking is, why are we playing on a roof? We're not playing to anybody. Who's going to see us? The lady across the street on the 4th floor? But he says, yeah, if you guys want to do it, I'll be there, I'll do it. And then they start to write down a draft of possible songs for the rooftop, and we see songs like Don't Let Me Down, Get Back, I've Got a Feeling, etc. And this is 2 days before performing. And again, it's January 28th, and it's still very, very disorganized. And so, moving to slide number 8, we see Mike McCartney arrives in the studio, and there's a very strange scene of him pretending to play the piano with the lid closed. And he just comes across as a very strange duck. And then we have the Beatles jamming again, wasting more time with the clock ticking down. Those are my thoughts. And then George is talking to John about doing an album of his own material, which was a precursor to All Things Must Pass. And then there's more jamming. And I don't see a sense of urgency. And I'm thinking to myself, how do they think this is going to come together? All right, so let's move to slide number 9. And it's January 30th. It's the day of the rooftop performance. Remember, it was originally scheduled for the 29th, but because of weather conditions on the 29th, they moved it to the 30th. And we're told the Beatles are still uncertain about performing on the roof. It's the day of the performance, and they're uncertain. And again, we're told there are 9 cameras, the number 9, 5 on the roof, 1 across the street, and 3 at street level, plus the hidden camera in the lobby. And then it looked to me that they brought all of the equipment from the basement studio to the roof, and there was no explanation about the decking installed on the roof. It just appears. In episode 2, when they're considering the rooftop performance, they go to the roof and they're wondering whether the roof can hold the weight that will be there because of the equipment and the entourage and all of that stuff. But in episode 3, we don't get any dialogue about how they closed on the roof supporting them playing up there. We are told that Glenn Johns and George Martin are recording from the basement studio with a closed circuit TV so they can see what's going on. And so you get to watch the entire rooftop performance. And so what I did on slide number 10 is, as I was watching them playing on the rooftop, I had some observations. And then I took my observations and I emailed them to my friend, who is a professional sound engineer, and I wanted to get his thoughts and feedback. Okay, so let me just lower this down here so I don't block his response. So my first observation: Glenn Johns and George Martin are in the basement studio recording the performance on the roof with a closed circuit TV so they can see what's going on. Apple was a 5-story building. This means there are 5 stories between the recorder in the basement and the mics on the roof. This made me wonder about the cabling. They would have had to snake at least 75 feet or more of cable to connect the mics to the recorder in the basement. Is there a risk of possible sound degradation because of cable length? And so my friend responded that they might have used military power supply for boosting the tie lines. Also, the mics were a mixture of Newmans and AKGs, very good microphones, and he determined that the cables are not an issue. And then my next observation was the Beatles arrive on the roof with all of the mics set in place, and unless it was omitted from the film, there is no sound check performed to measure levels. How did Glenn Johns and George Martin know they had everything set up properly without a check? And so my friend responded, that's the difference between the men and the boys. A very experienced engineer can do it without the sound checks. Real professionals do not need to set up gains. They know how loud a kick drum, vocal, or a guitar amp is. Wisdom comes with age and experience. And then I noted as Ringo gets on the roof, he starts to move his drum set around without any consideration for microphone positions. By moving the kit after the mics were set in place would mean that Glenn Johns and George Martin should have rechecked the sound levels for the drums. And then my friend responded, maybe a little readjustment, but not a big deal. Then I noted there is no group tuning. We see each of them tuned separately. Tuning individually by ear means the possibility of not being in tune with each other is possible. When they were in the studio, they would often manually tune to the keyboard. My friend responded, well, tuning is a big issue. It's all by ear. They do not show annoying tunings at all. It makes me wonder how bad the tunings are compared to the record. If each guitar is out of tune, then there's intonation problems, meaning there is dissonance between the instruments. And then I noted there were 2 Vox floor monitors facing the band which were not angled toward their ears, but sitting flat across the roof. Not angling the monitors could make it more challenging to hear themselves singing, the harmonies, for example. And then my friend responded very briefly, maybe, maybe not. There's no way of knowing. But the point I was trying to make is, if you can't hear yourself very well, especially when you're singing and especially when you're doing harmonies, there's a risk that the harmonies will be off. And we didn't hear that on the rooftop. Then I said the PA speakers were positioned to point down to the street. I would think this setup would have created an echo effect with the music bouncing off of the buildings across the street and possibly finding its way back onto the recording. And then my friend responded, yes, of course, and you don't hear a thing. That's a big issue downstairs in the studio and on the roof if the monitors were on while recording. If the monitors were off, then the volume of the guitar and bass amps must have been very low in order to not use any headphones. But the wordings, or the singing, was way too clean in regards to monitor bleeding in my opinion. But it might have possibly been a, quote, lucky setting. And let me move my PIP up here now. And then my next observation, Lennon mentions his hands are getting too cold to play chords, and we see him a couple of times trying to warm his hands in between songs. This made me wonder about how limber their hands were to play effectively. And then my friend responded, yes, right, temperature. I don't see any heaters. Maybe the lighting brought some heat. I don't know. And then my last observation. The quality of the playback on the documentary does not sync up with what I would have expected to hear based on the setup I observed on the roof. The recording of the performance was very clean. The vocals and harmonies were spot on. The playing was far better than any of the rehearsals we heard during the documentary. They went from rambling and mediocre to tight and very good overnight. And then my friend responded, exactly. I believe the basement audio was a rehearsal. The rooftop was real. They did play each song a couple of times, so audio and video takes may have been exchanged between the takes. For example, audio might have been swapped between takes or, quote, cut, and the visuals were then adjusted in relation to these cuts. If a video cut does not work perfectly, you can insert, quote, off-camera shots to replace a particular part of the video. When done properly, it looks like one big take. And so with my observations and my friend's feedback, let's move to slide 11. Okay, so slide 11, titled Rooftop Thoughts. And I just wanted to put a perspective on the table before I got into the chart. Get Back delivered almost 8 hours of content, which culminated to a 42-minute performance consisting of only 5 songs. So just pause and think about that for a moment. 8 hours of content, culminating to a 42-minute performance consisting of 5 songs. And the reason why I circled 42 is because 4 plus 2 equals 6. The performance was real, meaning the Beatles did play live. I listened very closely to see if I could detect them playing along to a backing track. And I did not detect that. Now, that being said, that does not mean that there weren't audio or visual edits that took place as a normal process of making the film. There's going to be post-production work done on either Michael Lindsay Hogg's 1970 Let It Be film or Peter's Get Back documentary. Because whether it's Michael or Peter, they're looking to present the very best possible audio-visual experience to their audience. So there's always going to be some level of editing. They may have sliced bars or, quote, comped some of the music so that it sounded better. When you watch the rooftop scene, whether you're watching Michael's version or Peter's version, there are a number of cutaways where they move away from the band and they're going down to the street level, as an example. So when they do that cutaway, that's a way that they can camouflage or hide the fact that an edit was made. And then when you put it all together, the enhanced audio with the different visuals, whether they're using inserts or cutaways, it looks seamless. And I'm just putting that out there as a possibility. The performance consisted of 9 takes of 5 Beatles songs. So there's the number 9 again. Get Back at 3 takes. Don't Let Me Down had 2 takes. I've Got a Feeling had 2 takes. One After 909, 1 take, and Dig a Pony, one take. The visuals and audio of the 2021 rooftop scene, along with the entire Get Back documentary, was significantly enhanced using state-of-the-art technology. And in my opinion, this resulted in audio playback that sounded too polished and more, quote, studio sounding than live. When I went back to the original 1970 Let It Be film and rewatched and re-listened to the rooftop scene, I found the performance and sound was more authentic and realistic, meaning the original 1970 film, again, in my opinion, did a better job of capturing the essence of playing live. It just had a more raw, live feel to it. And I'll leave a link down below in the description box so you can watch the original rooftop scene from the original 1970 film. And then the total runtime for all 3 episodes of Peter's documentary is 468 minutes, which is 4 plus 6 plus 8, which equals 18, and 1 plus 8 equals 9. So there's the number 9 again. Okay, so with that, let's move to the next slide and talk a little bit about Phil Spector. Okay, so I was waiting for Peter's documentary to mention Phil Spector, and he is never discussed. And so I thought that the omission of Phil Spector's role supports the premise of Get Back presenting revisionist history. Now, I covered this in my episode 2 review, but Phil was invited by John Lennon and George Harrison to take on the task of turning the Beatles' abandoned Let It Be recording sessions and turning them into a, quote, usable album. So the Beatles lost interest in the Get Back sessions. And later on, I'm going to play a clip where Glyn Johns is interviewed, and he says essentially the same thing. And then also in my episode 2 review, I took you through a quote that John had made in an interview with Rolling Stone magazine titled Lennon Remembers, and he was asked about Phil Spector's work on the Let It Be album. And to revisit that quote, John says that Phil was given the shittiest load of badly recorded shit with a lousy feeling toward it ever, and he made something out of it. He did a great job. And then I asked the question, how did Phil Spector clean up, quote, the shittiest load of badly recorded shit? Were composites or comps created? I would say that that's a given, that took place. So Phil Spector played a major role in producing the Let It Be album, but he's never mentioned in Get Back. Now, Peter Jackson might argue that his documentary focused on the 30 days of the Get Back session from January 2nd through January 31st, and that Phil's role was outside the scope of the film. But the problem with that argument is that during the Get Back documentary, it points out takes which ended up on the album, an album that Phil Spector produced. So my impression of the Get Back documentary, never bringing up Phil Spector, is that it was looking to sweep the not-so-happy moments under the rug in order to present the sessions as an achievement. So in other words, no unhappy talk. This film is all about presenting the Beatles in a positive light. But the problem with that is that it's not truly representative of what was really going on with the Beatles during that time period. And so by leaving Phil out of the equation, that was a big hole in Peter's documentary, because Phil Spector played a major role, whether you liked his work or not, in producing and releasing the Let It Be album back in 1970. And with that, let me play a brief clip of Glyn Johns being interviewed, and he's talking about the Get Back sessions. And he mentions how the Beatles lost interest in the sessions and turned the tapes over to him. And if I recall my Beatle history correctly, Glyn Johns was working on releasing an album called Get Back that was comprised of the recordings from the Get Back sessions. That album was never released. You can find it as a bootleg. And instead, it was the Phil Spector version of the sessions that got released in 1970 as the Let It Be album. And as you listen to this interview, especially when it gets to the end, you can see that there is still some resentment or sour grapes between Glyn Johns and the fact that the Beatles, and specifically John Lennon, ended up turning the tapes over to Phil Spector to release the album. Let's take a listen.
Yeah, because they had asked for you to come back from
somewhere. And then, okay, so then we finished Abbey Road. A period of time goes by and I get a call from John and Paul. They asked me to meet them at Abbey Road. So I jump in the car and go up there. I walk in the control room and there's a pile of multi-track tapes. And they said, do you remember that idea that you had made us acetates of? So I said, yeah. So they said, well, we think that's probably the best way to do the record. And we'd like you to do it. And I went, well, that's fantastic, great. So I said, well, when did we start? And they said, well, we don't start. You're going to do it on your own like you did before. And I thought, well, that's fantastic. They've got all this confidence in me to go away and do this without them there. And in the car on the way home, I thought, hold on a minute. I realized it wasn't anything to do with that. They were bored rigid with it, and they weren't interested anymore. They'd lost interest, so they were quite happy to just give it to me to go away and do, which was a bit disappointing, really. So it did get finished, and I did deliver it back to EMI, and then the band broke up. And it's well before it ever was talked about even being released. By now, Abbey Road's sort of well on the way. And then John Lennon came to America and formed a relationship with Phil Spector, which I always thought was a really, really strange combination of people. And he gave the tapes to Phil Spector, and who puked all over the bloody lot of them. And just awful, awful record now, I think.
Okay, so slide 13, my second to last slide. I wanted to capture some of my summary thoughts. As I watched the documentary, I thought there's more to these sessions than meets the eye. The film depicted a poorly planned and disorganized endeavor. There were many delays, lack of focus, continual off-topic activity, jams, playing old covers, and goofing off during rehearsals and recording. And of course, we had George Harrison walking out on January 10th, and he doesn't return until January 21st. Yet, even with all of these obstacles, the Beatles were able to pull it off because they are the Beatles. And as I mentioned a number of times as I was going through episode 1, 2, and 3, in my mind, the studio setup was not conducive to recording clean tracks. They had all of these active microphones. They were all playing in the room at the same time. They were playing through a PA. And lo and behold, in episode 3, we have George Martin coming out and talking about this and telling them that the sound is mucked up. Multiple recorded takes of any given song were done to create enough content to comp a complete song. So as an example, let's just say that the Beatles did 20 takes of Don't Let Me Down. Out of the 20 takes, they would decide, along with Glyn Johns and George Martin, which was the overall best take. And then they went back to the other takes and they sliced the tape to copy and paste or cut and paste better parts into the best take. So in the end, what winds up happening is they create a final version of the song. So the initial best take becomes a best take by doing the editing. The premise of writing from scratch is unlikely. 4 songs were front and center from the very beginning. They were Don't Let Me Down, I've Got a Feeling, Two of Us, and Dig a Pony. And they appear to have been mostly written coming into the sessions. One After 909 was around since 1963, so all they did was dust that off. And Get Back, although it was depicted as written from scratch, it emerges early on from the Twickenham sessions, starting on January 7th. And then we see the song come up again on January 9th, 10th, and the 13th. And of course, all of this is before heading to Apple. So what I'm saying is Get Back did not emerge during the Apple session. So I'm thinking Billy had Get Back pretty much written. And as part of the script for the movie, they made it look like he was writing it from scratch. And if I'm correct that these songs were mostly written coming into the sessions, then all of the Rooftop songs were identified early on versus last-minute considerations. And as we know, there was post-production work which included recording. As an example, I Me Mine was not recorded during the Get Back sessions. That was recorded in January of 1970, 1 year after the sessions. Recording or re-recording and editing continued on after the Get Back sessions. And this is documented by the official narrative. Okay, so that's what I mean by there's more to this than meets the eye. I sense that a lot of what was going on, and my friend who's the sound engineer noted the same thing, that it appeared staged or scripted. And then you think to yourself, well, they're making a film. So why would there not be major segments or portions of the film that were scripted? It was like watching a reality TV show. And we all know, or I hope we all know, that reality TV shows are scripted as well. That's not to say that there weren't spontaneous moments. I'm sure there were plenty of them. But I also sense that there was a loose outline or a loosely defined script that was being followed. All right, so with that, let's move to my last slide. Get Back, Episode 3, Closing Thoughts. So, did I feel that the documentary was revising Beatle history? I think yes. I believe that it attempts to spin a lackluster outcome into a significant achievement. And I covered this in my Episode 2 review as well. So if some of this looks familiar, that's why. We have to go back to the original objective. The Beatles were going to write and record 14 new songs in less than 3 weeks, perform 2 live shows for a TV special broadcast. And what was the end result? 12 songs on the album, and we'll break the 12 songs down in a moment, and they performed on a roof to no audience and released a grainy, uninspired movie. So if we break down the 12 songs on the Let It Be album, what was really accomplished? Well, 2 of the songs were throwaways, Maggie May and Dig It, and both of those songs were omitted by Billy with the release of Let It Be Naked in 2003. Another 2 songs were not recorded during the Get Back sessions. I Me Mine was recorded in January of 1970, and Across the Universe went back to 1968. So that leaves us with 8 original songs from the sessions, spanning 30 days. Let It Be, Get Back, For You Blue, I've Got a Feeling, Two of Us, Dig a Pony, One After 909, and like I said back in my Episode 2 review, I consider that to be filler track. Somebody disagreed, but that's okay. We all have our certain likes and dislikes with regard to Beatle music. And then, last but not least, Long and Winding Road. And Billy Preston was instrumental during the sessions. Before Billy showed up, those sessions were flat. They were going nowhere. So Billy Preston pumped life into the sessions. And without his contribution, my opinion is it's possible the entire project might have been shelved permanently, that we may not have even seen a Let It Be album. The documentary never discusses Phil Spector, and I view this as a glaring omission. And I think it was done to avoid the negative aspects of the story and what was going on during that time period with the Beatles. So the film came across to me as a classic Hollywood script, where the heroes persevere and overcome adversity and pull through in the end. It's the Cinderella story. And so therefore, the film was designed to be a feel-good story and was not representative of the historical narrative. And this includes the narrative that we get directly from the Beatles themselves through the many interviews. And I took you through the Rolling Stone interview from 1971 with John Lennon. And, John was pretty clear about how he felt going into the sessions and how he felt during the sessions. And he tells us that George Harrison felt the same way. And so that concludes my review and my thoughts on Peter Jackson's documentary, Get Back. And before we head out, I'm going to leave you with a song that goes way back. And I want you to listen to that song. And you tell me if that song doesn't sound an awful lot like Happy Christmas, War is Over. That's it. You guys have a great day. Take care, and we will talk soon.
A racehorse, and he wore a high hat, and the mane on his foretop was as fine as silk thread. His bridle was silver, his mane it was gold, and the worth of his saddle has never been told. I rode him in England, I rode him in Spain. He never did lose, boy, he always did gain. So come all you gamblers, wherever you are, don't bet your money